Vietnam, East or Southeast Asia? To some of you, the answer may seem obvious. To others, perhaps not so much. Being at the crossroads of East and Southeast Asia, Vietnam's status confounds many. Today, I'll be trying to answer that question. However, I will preface by saying that I am not Vietnamese, and that my answers are likely informed at least in part from me being an ethnic Korean. Anyway, in order to answer that question, I think that first we'll have to know, what exactly are East and Southeast Asia? I'll provide two ways of defining the regions, one geographic and one cultural. I'll start with the geographic one, since that one is a bit easier. The geographic borders of East and Southeast Asia are defined primarily by politics, rather than natural features. The UN defines East Asia as being the territory currently administered by China, Japan, the Koreas, Mongolia, and Taiwan. Southeast Asia consists of the Indochinese Peninsula, which is neither Indian nor Chinese, and the islands of the Malay Archipelago, which does not include Taiwan. However, generally only half of the island of New Guinea, the part that is administered as part of Indonesia, is included. When looking at a map, Vietnam seems pretty clearly Southeast Asian, being situated along the eastern coast of the Indochinese Peninsula. However, if Vietnam never historically expanded south and stayed in what is now the north, it may just have ended up being considered part of East Asia by the UN as well. The southernmost parts of China may also have been considered to be Southeast Asia, if China had never historically expanded south. Things get a bit murkier in regards to natural geography. Much of the country shares the same tropical climate typical of Southeast Asia, alongside similar flora and fauna. However, parts of northern Vietnam, like Hanoi, share a climate similar to that of southern coastal areas of China, such as Hong Kong. These parts of China are also often placed into the same floristic and faunal region as Southeast Asia. I'll go into a bit more detail for the cultural definitions of East and Southeast Asia. I'll be talking primarily about Chinese influence in East Asia and Indian influence in Southeast Asia. However, it should be remembered that the cultures of both areas are more than these influences and all unique in their own right. Culturally, East Asia is synonymous with the East Asian cultural sphere, also known as the Sinosphere, the part of the world historically heavily influenced by Chinese civilization and culture. There are several commonalities present across East Asia, generally cultural influences originating from China. The states of East Asia were territorially defined with fixed borders, and their governance was based upon Chinese political models and philosophy. In terms of belief systems, there is the enduring legacy of the three teachings, Confucianism, Taoism, and Mahayana Buddhism, which coexisted throughout the region, leaving imprints on things such as governance, society, and art. The states of East Asia historically used classical Chinese for writing official documents, and Chinese loanwords have greatly entered into the lexicons of even non-Sinic languages of East Asia, in particular for words which described complex concepts such as those relating to things like government and philosophy. Even for modern and Western concepts, East Asian languages often share words due to the Japanese creating new words from Chinese characters after the Meiji Restoration. Even with their writing systems, Japanese kana are ultimately descended from Chinese characters, and while Hangul is not, it shares the same stroke order, and the system was nonetheless designed to aesthetically fit when written alongside Chinese characters. There are other things as well. The hip and gable roof is an iconic feature of East Asian architecture. Chopsticks, originating from China, are a staple utensil used by East Asians. The calendars traditionally used in East Asia were the Chinese calendar and its descendants. Even names are often Chinese style for non-Sinic groups, although Japanese may be somewhat of an exception. Of course, I can't go into every similarity there is within the East Asian cultural sphere. However, I think this gives a good enough idea of the various commonalities present within the region. Culturally, Southeast Asia is generally divided into mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. Despite this, I will begin by speaking about what Southeast Asia does have in common. the region has in common a history of heavy Indian influence due to historic ties with the kingdoms of southern coastal India, which heavily influenced the art, language, and societies of Southeast Asia. Before Islam was brought into the region by traders, the kingdoms of Southeast Asia were primarily Hindu and Buddhist. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, one of the most famous architectural marvels of Southeast Asia, was originally created as a Hindu temple dedicated to the god Vishnu. Bali, arguably Indonesia's most famous tourist spot, is still predominantly Hindu. Unlike in East Asia, where states were territorially defined by the lines they drew at their boundaries, Southeast Asian polities followed the mandala model, mandala meaning circle in Sanskrit, in which they were defined by the center, and control elsewhere depended upon personal relationships between local rulers and their often overlapping tributary overlords. Mainland Southeast Asia today is predominantly Theravada Buddhist, the type also present in Sri Lanka, whereas maritime Southeast Asia has become mostly Muslim, with the primarily Catholic Philippines being a notable outlier. We will see the Philippines increasingly being an outlier in the region after their conquest by the Spanish. Linguistic zones in Southeast Asia can also be divided into mainland and maritime. There is a mainland Southeast Asia linguistic area, one of the most linguistically diverse regions of the world, where the languages, while genetically unrelated, have come to share features due to their close proximity to one another. Maritime Southeast Asia is dominated by Austronesian speakers, who, beyond Southeast Asia, stretch from Madagascar in the west to Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, in the east. While there is some influence from Chinese, the languages of Southeast Asia have been greatly influenced by Sanskrit and Pali, the liturgical languages of Hinduism and Theravada Buddhism, respectively. Maritime Southeast Asia has also seen influence from Persian and, more recently, Arabic and European languages. Most of the traditional scripts of Southeast Asia, whether it be Thai, Khmer, Javanese, or even Baybayin in the Philippines, are all Brahmic scripts, ultimately derived from the Pallava script from southern India. The Jawi alphabet, however, descended from Arabic, is also a major script used today for Malay and other languages. Today, the traditional calendar used in mainland Southeast Asia is the Buddhist calendar, based on an old version of the Hindu calendar, while the Islamic calendar is used in maritime Southeast Asia. In Java, the most populous island of Indonesia, they use a special calendar which synthesizes both the Hindu and Islamic calendars. Unlike East Asians, Southeast Asians traditionally did not use chopsticks until relatively recently, using their hands to eat instead. However, in the past few hundred years, and during the 19th and early 20th centuries especially, as China was falling apart, many Chinese people from areas such as Guangdong, Fujian, and Yunnan began to move into the region, bringing with them their cuisine and chopsticks. While the favored utensils used in Southeast Asia today are the fork and spoon, chopsticks are used for dishes which originate from these Chinese immigrants, such as various noodle dishes. So, that finally gets us to the Vietnamese. As a state, Vietnam was a Chinese-style territorially defined state. Its government was based on Chinese models, and Vietnamese students studied the Chinese classics to take civil service exams, like in China and Korea. As a society, Vietnam was historically influenced by the three teachings, Confucianism, Taoism, and Mahayana Buddhism, in contrast to its Theravada Buddhist neighbors. The Nguyen Lords and dynasty, Vietnam's final dynasty, referred to themselves as Han, and with Emperor Minh Mang even referring to Vietnam as Trung Quốc, meaning the Middle Kingdom. They saw themselves as bringing Confucian East Asian civilization to peoples such as the Khmer, Chams, and the Hill tribes. The name Vietnam itself originates from Chinese, Nam coming from the word for south in Chinese, and Viet, pronounced Ye in Mandarin, in reference to who the Chinese referred to as the 100 Ye, the various ethnic groups which occupied what is now southern China and northern Vietnam 2,000 years ago. Vietnam often simply called itself the South, or the Great South, or Southern Country, defining itself in relation to China, which was the North. In terms of language, Vietnamese shares many similarities with East Asian languages. Instead of having much of its vocabulary derived from Sanskrit and Pali, roughly a third of Vietnamese vocabulary is estimated to be borrowed from Chinese, and up to 60% in formal texts. This is similar to languages like Korean and Japanese, which are also genetically unrelated to Chinese. However, the languages used when writing formal texts was Classical Chinese, and when Vietnamese was written, it was in Chu Nom, a script derived from Chinese but made to fit the Vietnamese language. However, this should not discount the fact that Vietnamese is an Austroasiatic language. This language family is present across mainland Southeast Asia and the eastern Indian subcontinent. Cambodian, certainly Southeast Asian, is an Austroasiatic language. Furthermore, Vietnamese is part of the mainland Southeast Asia linguistic area, sharing many features with other languages of the area, although Southern Sinic languages like Cantonese and Pinghua are also part of this grouping. The traditional calendar used in Vietnam was based off of the Chinese calendar, and it is still used for calculating the date of many holidays such as Tet, the Vietnamese New Year and most important Vietnamese holiday. Like in China, children receive red envelopes containing money from their elders. Vietnamese cuisine incorporates the Chinese notion of the 5 elements as well as yin and yang, and also uses chopsticks. However, it also incorporates many of the tropical ingredients also present in mainland Southeast Asia, such as lemongrass and basil. Vietnamese architecture has been heavily influenced by Chinese architecture. This can be seen clearly in buildings such as the Temple of Literature in Hanoi and the Imperial City of Hue, which is based in large part off of the Forbidden City in Beijing. There are many other cultural features which Vietnam shares with East Asia, from clothing to traditional instruments and games like Go. I cannot go into all of them. However, it is pretty clear that culturally, at least, Vietnam is East Asian. The modern era has made it increasingly harder to answer the question of whether Vietnam is East or Southeast Asian, and what it means to be either. Today, the nations of both East and Southeast Asia have all undergone significant westernization and exist today as Western-style Westphalian states with Western-style governments and institutions. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw extensive migration into Southeast Asia by the Chinese. The overseas Chinese today play a major role in Southeast Asian politics, business, and media. Vietnam was directly colonized by Europe, a fate shared by much of Southeast Asia, but unlike most of East Asia. Vietnam no longer uses Chu Nom, or Chinese, to write, but rather the Latin script first used by the Romans and introduced to them by the French. Vietnam today is a member of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I've seen some people who see that Vietnam is Southeast Asian in part because it is relatively poorer. However, I think wealth is a very poor way to measure whether Vietnam is East or Southeast Asian, considering that North Korea, which is very clearly East Asian, is considerably poorer than Vietnam, and Brunei, which is very clearly Southeast Asian, has achieved considerable amounts of wealth due to its oil reserves. It also doesn't tell anything apart from how rich a country is. What do you think? Is Vietnam East or Southeast Asian? Personally, I think Vietnam can be both East and Southeast Asian simultaneously. Culturally, Vietnam is certainly more East Asian, but I don't think that necessarily has to prevent it from being Southeast Asian. Both terms which mean different things to different people. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button to receive notifications whenever I release a new video. Also, please leave a comment for the algorithm.